Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so episode 24 brings the Han Solo miniseries. So a bit of information on these comics. It's a 5-issue miniseries, and issue number 1 was released in June 2016. Issue number 5 was released November 2016. The trade paperback was released in January 2017. And oddly enough, there's a hardcover version of this, which has these 5 issues, which also has the full second volume of the main run of Star Wars comics, the Showdown on Smugglers Moon, which I've covered in a previous episode, episode 13 of Star Wars Comics in Canon. I speak about Volume 2 of the main run of Star Wars comics. So yeah, interestingly, just the hardcover of Han Solo comes with that, but anyway. This miniseries is set at 0 ABY, so it's 0 years after the Battle of Yavin, so it's set after the Death Star blew up, and it also seems to be set before the events of the second volume of the main run of Star Wars comics. So in previous episodes, I've spoken about the Lando, the Princess Leia, and the Chewbacca miniseries, and they're all a part of the Heroes for a New Hope collection, and I'm not 100% sure on the Lando one, but I'm pretty sure that the Lando one takes place around the same time the Chewie and the Princess Leia ones do, which are both after the events of A New Hope, but before the main events of the main run of Star Wars comics, which I've covered in this show as well. So the Han Solo one, I believe, takes place at the same time also. It's not part of the Heroes for a New Hope collection, even though its general timeline and a few other things would work with that. It finished like a couple weeks after the Heroes for a New Hope collection was released, so I feel like if they tried to include the Han Solo comics as well, it would have probably delayed Heroes for a New Hope by another year, and then it would have 4 whole sets of miniseries, so it would be even more of a chunkier book. But basically, this just goes hand in hand with the comics from Heroes for a New Hope, and I recommend checking out the other episodes of the Star Wars Comics in Canon that goes into that. The miniseries was written by Marjorie Liu, the penciler was Mark Brooks, and the inker was actually Mark Brooks for issues 1, 4 and 5, but Dexter Vines for issues 2 and 3. The colourist was Sonia Obeck, and a guy called Matt Milla helped Sonia on issue number 4 for the colouring. Before we get into the narrative side, I'll just give a little bit more information. Now, I will say some of the bio about Han Solo I did include in episode number 10, which was the Han Solo Imperial Cadet series. That mini-series was set before the events of Solo, or kind of during the events of Solo, when there's sort of that time jump and then he's in the war and all that sort of jazz. So it covers his time as the Imperial Cadet, whereas this one covers his time after New Hope. So if you want to check out the other Han Solo miniseries that's out, check out episode 10 of Star Wars Comics in Canon, where I go into more detail, but here's just a bit more bio information about Han. So Han was born approximately 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, so at A New Hope, around also this comic, he was around 32 years old. Chewie was born in 200 BBY, so at the time of A New Hope, he is 200 years old. So I'm just going to read the opening crawl for this comic. I have forgotten to do it on a couple of other episodes, so apologies about that. I'm going to try and make more of a concerted effort to do that in the future. So, Han Solo. It is a period of unrest. In a galaxy oppressed by the Empire's unrelenting brutality, there is little hope for change. Nonetheless, rebels have banded together to fight back against such corruption. While the rebellion grows in power, Imperials fight to crush any hope for an overthrow. With the Empire's hands full, the opportunities for crime are endless. Han Solo has taken a step back from the rebel cause, returning his focus to what he does best, smuggling. Untrusting by nature, he is skeptical of any who cross his path. Unfortunately for him, he cannot stay under the radar forever. And I will say that this comic is one of the ones where I really recommend people pick it up and read it, because there's lots of really cool space battles. The artwork in it is amazing, and the space battles, as I said, are really, really good, and they're only really done justice if you read them yourself. I don't go into huge depth about space battles and all the action sequences in these comics because it's hard to explain and it's not very fun to, so I just kind of stick to the narrative and a lot of things that connect the dots. There's also a narrative, as in you have Han Solo narrating aspects of this comic, and his narrations are very cool, and it kind of shows his sort of progression as to becoming more sympathetic with the rebel cause, less into being, just for himself and just a smuggler who's in it for himself all the time. And it does show that sort of slight variation from the standard Han Solo way of thinking, which I found quite cool. I won't be reading out much of it, if at all, because there's quite a lot of it, and well, as I said, I do want these comic episodes for you guys to be able to listen, absorb the information about the comic, but also if you read the comic yourself, you'll actually get a lot more out of it as well, not only by the visuals, but also certain elements, because I'm just not going to read it verbatim. So issue 1 starts with Han trying to do jobs to pay back Jabba, but he ends up declining pretty much all the ones that come to him. He has this strange feeling, just this odd thing he can't describe, where he just doesn't want to do them in certain capacities, and he's running out of options and things because, as everyone knows in Empire Strikes Back, he owed Jabba a lot of money at that point. It is mentioned in A New Hope because he gets pursued by Imperials and then he drops a massive shipment of spice. When he meets Jabba in A New Hope, he does speak about that sort of thing, and then Empire Strikes Back is when he gets captured by Boba and then puts in carbonite and given back to Jabba the Hutt because obviously the debt that he owes him. So in this comic, he's trying to get back some of the money, trying to be able to afford to pay back Jabba, worrying about what's going to happen to him in the future if he doesn't. And while he's sort of declining a lot of these jobs here and there, he then is taken at gunpoint, and he's not really sure what's going on, but then it turns out it's a couple of rebels. They take him to a secret little room, and then he gets a transmission by Leia. It's a recorded one, and it's basically asking him to go and see her because she's got a job for him. He goes to the rebel fleet, he's told about the Dragon Void Run, and is asked to enter as a sort of cover. When he speaks to Leia about the Dragon Void Run, there's another individual there called General Aaron Kraken. He does show up in other comics as well. He shows up in the Afra comics. He's mentioned in the Alphabet Squadron book, and also he is actually in Star Wars Return of the Jedi. So he does appear in Episode 6, and what seems to have happened is he wasn't fully named in that, and then they basically just named him after the fact and have used him in a few other things. I seem to recall in Legends there's a lot about him, but as this is very much a canon style podcast, I'm not trying to worry too much about what happens in Legends. I'll just say, yeah, he's General Aaron Kraken. He doesn't appear in these comics that much more, but he has a general distrust for Solo, who he sees as just like a smuggler, one who's in it for himself and very selfish. So, Han is basically told to get into the Dragon Void Run as a cover. Essentially, the Dragon Void Run goes to 3 different planets to refuel among the whole races, and the Rebellion have got agents on each of these planets who need to be picked up by Solo when he's refueling, and then taken back to the Rebellion because they seemingly keep dying, and no one's fully sure why they're dying or what's going on. And they've all each got a lot of sensitive information, but they don't have enough to sort of go on by themselves. Each of them has almost like a piece of the puzzle, and then they're all meant to meet up with Leia, each give her the piece of information they know, and then they'd have a fuller picture, because if any one of them has the whole picture, it can be very dangerous if it goes into the wrong hands. So Han gets to the Dragon Void race, he speaks with the competition things, and the race starts, he goes off, and then as soon as they go to sort of the first area where the race is beginning, there's lots of ships getting shot at and blown up, and that's where the first comic ends. The second comic starts with a pretty intense amount of panels. That it's actually one of the most visually appealing comics I've read of all the Star Wars comics. Like I can't hail Mark Brooks, Dexter Vines, Sonia Obeck, and Matt Milla enough, because they've all done incredible jobs in this. And the space battles in this comic, I may even argue, are some of the best looking space battles in any of the comics I've seen at all. Like, it is incredible. I can't recommend people go check out this comic enough, if only for the visual aspect of it. But it's a really intense set of panels. The way it's all laid out is really, really cool. And essentially what it is the Dragon Void Run is one of the most dangerous and one of the most ancient races in the whole galaxy. And each time they do it, they add more obstacles, more things to kind of get the pilots. And in this instance, they are mines. So they look like kind of like jellyfishes, almost, but with no tentacles, that sort of shape. And they follow ships, they lock onto them, and then they shoot at them quite a lot. And they're basically going around shooting ships, and Han's a bit of an odds at it, not expecting all this sort of stuff. And then there's a character called Delan Vuk who uses the Falcon as a sort of shield, because obviously the Falcon is a big circular disc, it's quite easy to hide behind or under, and he uses it as a sort of shield, and then he starts to shoot at some of the mines, the probes, whatever you wish to call them, because they're following and pursuing both his ship and the Falcon, and he ends up kind of shooting basically at the Falcon. He doesn't seem to have done a direct hit on the Falcon, but it's still not nice being shot at and having some of the shields and things damaged partially by being shot at. And to basically get out of that, Han manages to evade some of the shoots and things, and then catches Delane's ship with his own ship. He catches the Falcon on it and does a bit of damage. Now, a bit of interesting information about Delan Vuk. Apologies, I keep saying Delane. It's Delan, so it's Delan. He is a Pantoran. Now, Pantoran is basically just a human with blue skin, to be very, very simplistic. They are in the Clone Wars. There's an episode called Sphere of Influence where they are quite prevalent in, and I think there's like a little arc there where a young Pantoran senator who is friends with Padme, I think there's like an assassination attempt sort of thing going on there. And funnily enough, the interesting thing about Pantorans is they're in the Clone Wars, as I said, the series, as well as Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And it is the only cameo with George Lucas. He plays a Pantoran. So he plays a character called Baron Papanoida. And I don't think he has any speaking roles or he does anything. You can kind of see him there. And that character appears in the Sphere of Influence Clone Wars episode, but is not voiced by George Lucas. It's voiced by a gentleman named Corey Burton. So that's quite cool. So if anyone ever asks you what species George Lucas was cameoing and what episode, is Episode 3 is George Lucas's only cameo, and he cameoed as a Pantoran named Baron Papanoida. And one other thing I'll say is that Pantorans often get, or rather, there's a species called the Chiss, and anyone who's seen Star Wars Rebels, is a fan of old Legends material, or has read any of the new or old Thrawn books will know of a certain Chiss named Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn is a very prevalent character in the EU, as in the expanded universe / Legends, and he is in one of the most prevalent and most popular Legend stories there are. I believe it's called Heir to the Empire, and it's meant to be basically the sequel trilogy made by Disney. Is relatively speaking, it has a lot of similarities to that trilogy with Thrawn in and that sort of stuff. And essentially, Thrawn is a Chiss, and Chiss look basically the same as Pantorans, except Chiss have got red eyes, whereas Pantorans seem to have a variety of eye colours. The Chiss are from unknown regions in space, while Pantorans are from the moon of Pantora. Basically, they're just blue-skinned humans. Essentially, Chiss have got red eyes and are a bit more mysterious, not seen very often, and the Pantorans are much more prevalent in the galaxy. So Delan Vuk is a Pantoran. After Han and Delan have that sort of interaction, Han, clips his ship. Han then realises that the mines seem to lock onto ships that are either moving or are activated, and they seem to completely ignore any of the ships that have got debris, the ones that are just floating in space that have been destroyed. So Han flies sort of near them and then just turns off his ship and floats on by, using his sort of momentum to keep himself moving enough in the right direction without the mines sort of noticing. The mines do quickly stop noticing him and go off elsewhere. And as he's sort of floating by, there's a character called Loo Re Anno. And what she does is, she, from the start of the race, didn't even turn her engine on while everyone is getting shot by the mines. She shoots a little grapple hook onto the Falcon, and then the Falcon pulls her to the next area. Now, Loo Re Anno is quite an interesting character, but her species is unknown. To describe them as anything anyone else would really see, if anyone has seen Shape of Water or the first 2 Hellboy films made by Guillermo del Toro, which has got Ron Perlman in and things, there's a character in Hellboy called Abe, and there's also the main fish character in Shape of Water. I can't remember what they're called. Basically fish people. They look a lot like that, and she has got like a fish head, but her body is fairly humanoid, but it's got scales and things like that. She says that she's basically like the last of her kind, but you don't really know anything else about her. I've looked online. She's just the last of her kind, and the species is called the species of Loo Re Anno. So, yeah, that's she's a really interesting character. We'll get more into her a bit later on. But yeah, she hooks onto the Falcon and cruises along, and then they go to the next planet for refueling. And I will say the 3 planets in the Dragon Void run seemingly aren't ever identified, so I don't know what planets they are or what they could be. When they get on this other planet, Han squares up to Delan and is basically saying to him, you shouldn't shoot at me, all this sort of other stuff, that's not cool, it's disrespectful, blah, blah, blah. And Loo Re overhears their conversation. She comes over and agrees with Han, and she says to Han in front of Delan, saying, look, we can do a complaint, everyone saw him shoot at you, if you complain against him, we could probably get him disqualified from the race. And Han kind of looks at it and goes, no, he's not even worth the time, and then walks away. Loo Re continues to talk to Delan and says, look, what you did wasn't cool, like, that's not fair, don't do that sort of stuff again. It's also noted that Loo Re Anno's people are actually the people who created the Dragon Void run. So her species are very ancient, and they created this run, and that's probably one of the reasons she's flying it. And people who fly this run are known as some of the best pilots in the galaxy. All of the pilots are fairly well known, except Han Solo, who, when the race is going on, there's, you've got Han Solo's internal monologue, you've also got the standard speech of characters and all the sort of sound effects and things, and you've also got the announcer for the Dragon Void run reading out, oh, and Han Solo takes the lead, and this happens, and that happens. I'm not going to read out all those pieces because they just add flavour text, but it's quite a lot going on, but it is really cool. Then as Han walks away from sort of Delan and Loo Re, people walk up to him and ask for his signature, like a crowd of people asking for it, because he did really well in the first heat after someone who no one's ever really heard of. And while he's kind of interacting with a lot of the crowd, a Dug species, warns him of the Empire who start to approach from behind. Now, a Dug is a very odd name for a species, but it may sound unfamiliar, but the most familiar one is everyone's favourite, Sebulba from The Phantom Menace. So that weird, almost, horse-faced creature that's really skinny and limp, kind of, they walk on their hands and things. The main evil antagonist in the pod racing, when Anakin is there, the one who speaks in, I believe, Huttese and, is like Jedi Poodle, that sort of stuff. And the one who sabotaged Anakin's pod racer and does eventually lose and things, but has like a squares off with Jar Jar at one point as well, earlier on in the film. That's a Dug. There's loads of them in the rest of the universe. I think in the Clone Wars, there's quite a few of them. I can't remember if there's any in Rebels, but I'm pretty certain in the Clone Wars there's a few of them. There's one episode where the younglings go off and do this sort of circus act thing, and the leader of this circus troupe is a Dug. So there are quite a few in the galaxy, but Sebulba's the most famous Dug. And yeah, a species of Dug warns Han of the Empire coming. And while this is happening, there seems to be in a lot of the panels this odd glowing orb that seems to follow around Han, and it's in most of the panels, but I'll get onto that later. While Han is kind of interacting with people and kind of being the face while the camera's recording him and things, Chewie manages to sneak off and meets with a rebel who gives him a man who is quite hesitant to actually want to cooperate. His name is Bot, just B-O-T, and he is actually a Duros. Now, Duros are blue-skinned, red eyes, and have no noses. The two most well-known Duros, I would probably say, are Shriv and Cad Bane. Shriv is in the Battlefront 2 campaign, which is a really fun campaign actually, a bit short, but it is fun. And Cad Bane is a very prominent antagonist in the Clone Wars series. He ends up collaborating with Boba Fett, with Aura Singh, with the Hutts quite a lot, and he ends up fighting Obi-Wan and I think Anakin quite a lot, as well as Ahsoka Tano. So if you've seen the Clone Wars series or you've played Battlefront 2, you'd know that. If you haven't, there is a Duros in A New Hope in the Cantina, one of them, which is only on screen for a few seconds. But if you saw one of these guys, you'd recognise it. It's kind of humanoid-ish, but the face looks like quite a stereotypical alien face, quite large, top of the head, big eyes, no nose, that sort of thing. So yeah, Chewie gets this guy, Bot, who's basically worried and things. He's worried that Wookiee will eat him. He calls Chewbacca a Wookiee, and he's worried that the Wookiee will eat him and stuff. And while he's kind of panicking and worrying and things, someone ends up shooting around where Bot or Chewie are. Chewie manages to kind of dive and grab Bot and get him to the ground and starts to kind of hide in things. And some onlookers catch this and saw that Chewie was the co-pilot of Han Solo in the race, and then they start yelling at the people who are shooting at them and start shooting back and things, and Chewie manages to kind of escape. Back to Han, the Empire manages to find the pilots, starts to round them up, rounds up Han and Delan, a few of the other pilots, and Loo Re Anno, and Delan, the Pantoran, is kind of arguing with them a bit. The stormtrooper smashes him in the face. Han says, come on guys, can we calm down? And he gets punched in the gut as well. And then while that's all kind of happening, Han is speaks to Loo Re a little bit and says, what about this orb thing? Can you get it away from me? And Loo Re says, I can't do anything about it. It just seems to like you. And that comic ends with a Imperial officer standing over Han saying, after he got hit in the chest and things, kind of making a bit of a scene, he says, we don't want to spill any blood on camera, do we? Issue number 3 starts with the Imperials threatening the pilots and Loo Re's lights and threatening to, because these orb things are kind of floating around and stuff. The Imperials are threatening to destroy them and shoot them and all this sort of other stuff. And Han interjects, says, come on, they're just balls of light, just leave them alone. Then the people who seem to be running the race, they're like hooded figures, you can't see, they don't appear to be the same species as Loo Re, but they're basically saying to the Empire, look, you can try and stop this race if you want to, but we've got sponsors and things. Each of these planets are like refueling stations that we allow the Empire to refuel on and things. If you want to cancel the race, and all of those refueling stations will close off use to the Empire and will hurt. We've paid a lot of money for this. There's a lot of people watching. You don't really want us to cancel this. So the Imperials kind of back down and allow the race to go ahead, and the race continues. On the Falcon, you've got Bot, that rebellion spy who's a Duros. He is wounded, but he's still seemingly alive, and he kind of got shot in the arm, and Chewie's injected him with some sort of paralytic, just kind of all he can do is talk, but his body's quite limp. And while that's happening, the orb thing, like Loo Re's light orb thingy, one of them, is still sort of following Han around. Bot confirms to Chewie and Han there are 3 informants alive, and one of them is a traitor. And what he believes is that there's him, there's 2 others, and one of the other 2 is basically the one murdering the other informants. Because although they didn't all have the same picture, some of the informants could communicate with each other just for safety reasons and things like that. If anything bad happened, they could communicate. And what it seems to be is one of these informants is going around and killing the other ones. The next part of the Dragon Void run is speeding through an obstacle course. You can't slow down at all. You have to be going over a certain speed, or you immediately get disqualified. And it seems to take about 12 hours to do, which is insane. And the artwork to show the 12 hours passing is really, really cool as well. Han seems to be doing really, really well. And then around the 12-hour mark, there's a point where the ship gets caught by something and is damaged a little bit. And the Pantoran Delan Vuk hooks the Falcon and pulls it, because when the Falcon got hit a little bit, they're starting to lose speed. And if they go under the certain speed, they get disqualified. But Delan Vuk shoots this grapple hook thing onto Solo and the Falcon and drags him along to make sure his speed does not drop below, so he doesn't get disqualified. And that's always a sort of now you don't owe me one sort of thing, after he basically kind of cheated in the last round and Han chose to not pursue him or prosecute, and therefore this Delan guy is still in the race. Then on the next planet, which is the second in the 3, Han is running and trying to get to the rebellion, but this rebel informant, the next one, but there's a lot of those floating cameras around, recording what people are doing. As he's kind of like, I've got to figure out how to get rid of these cameras and things. One of the glowing orb things that's hanging around him destroys both the cameras. It just shoots through, breaks both the cameras, because they're just floating cameras. There's no one operating them or anything. And so Han goes and finds that other informant. He finds this other informant, a person called Loo Re, to the Falcon, who recognises Han and Chewie and wants to settle a debt with Chewbacca. Now, Loo Re doesn't seem to be an identified species that I can find, but it's basically a white tiger person. Basically, somewhere up, if you just imagine a human, it's almost like there's I think Khajiit in Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls games, the sort of cat people. There's also, in some ways, almost, if you've seen Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, I think it is, when they take the Polyjuice potion and become other things, and then Hermione's got the sort of hair and becomes the cat person. It's kind of like that, but imagine if the cat person was basically a tiger humanoid that is white. So issue number 4, you got Han and Chewie. Basically, they are having this tiff with Loo Re, who says that Loo Re's like, you killed my baby, you killed this, did all this horrible stuff. And then Han is like, well, wait a minute, you had a baby Rathtar, and it was causing us problems. It almost killed me. If Chewie hadn't killed that Rathtar, I would be dead. So it's your own damn fault. And just to clarify, Rathtars, they're in The Force Awakens, so episode 7 of Star Wars. That's the bit where Rey and Finn basically meet Solo for the first time, and they're like, oh, what are you doing here? And he's saying, oh, he's hunting Rathtars. And they're like, oh, what's a Rathtar? And then it does the little comedic sucker on the screen behind it. And then the Rathtars obviously escape when Kanja Club and the other gang sort of surround Solo. And they're like a giant orb thing with thousands of teeth, loads of eyes, and massive long tentacles, and they are fearsome and kill things quite efficiently. So that's a nice little nod to the little Force Awakens. Then, while this sort of squabbling is taking place, Loo Re and 2 of these other pilots emerge. The other 2 pilots are Twi'leks or Twi'leks. It's basically Ayla Secura from the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars, and also you may recognise her from like the Battlefront games back in the PS2 days. She's a Twi'lek, and probably the most famous other 2 Twi'leks would be, there's one in Return of the Jedi who is dancing for Jabba, and then he drops her down the pit to be eaten by the Rancor, and the other one is Hera Syndulla. Hera Syndulla is in the Star Wars Rebels series, and I believe she's also appearing in the upcoming Star Wars Squadrons game. So they're basically just humans, but they have like 2 tentacles coming off the top of their heads. There's also a arc in the Clone Wars in the first series. It's an arc about Ryloth, and in Ryloth, that's I think where all the Twi'leks come from, or that's at least a huge population for the Twi'leks. So it's basically just humans with 2 tentacles coming out the back of their heads. They're very commonplace in the Star Wars galaxy. So these 2 Twi'leks, as well as Loo Re Anno, emerge, and Loo Re says, well, the light ball that's been following you around, Han, seemed to be quite concerned. So they all kind of arguing things and are squabbling over what's going on and what is Han really doing. Han manages to just get them all off the ship, and while that happens, Loo asks to speak with him separately. Now, Loo Re asks Solo what he knows about the Dragon Void run, and he says it's one of the oldest races in the galaxy. Every pilot worth his or her salt dreams of running it, guts and glory and all that. It's proof you're the best, and no one can take that from you. And she says, is that all? And he says, no. If you win the race, you'll be paid for the rest of your life. And he's like, oh, look, I need to. And then she interrupts him with a bit of information about Dragon Void as well as her species. So I'm just going to read out some of the things that Loo Re says. My grandmother was a founding member of the Dragon Void run, Pilot Solo. She was a map maker, first and foremost, but she also loved to fly, and fly fast. That is not unusual for my kind. What was different was that she did not want to fly alone. She wanted to create a community, build a family that would come together, to race one another, to challenge each other, become something more together. The Dragon Void and its ideals changed the culture of my people. We became unified in ways we had not thought possible. We no longer took pleasure in the embrace of solitude, but instead celebrated the unity we found in each other. For my people, the Dragon Void is a reminder of that promise. It is more than a race. It is a sacred right that demands we expand our dreams of what we can become. And Han says, why are you telling me this? And she says, stars are in your blood, Pilot Solo. All that you are, all that you have been, can be distilled into that one fact, and I see it in you, and so do the witnesses. And I believe the witnesses she's referring to are these glowing orb things. She's surrounded by, 4 or 5 of them, and that one is still kind of lingering around and following Solo. And then Han says, wait, I'm sorry. And she says, for what? And he says, well, they say you're the last of your kind. That means you no longer have anyone to fly with. And she says, I'm flying with you, am I not? We are all the last of something, Pilot Solo. Perhaps you are a dying breed as well. And she leaves him. Then after Loo is gone, Doré says that they can't fly off and leave the planet yet and continue with the race. They need to wait for the other informant. While that's happening, sort of, Doré and Bot are arguing with each other, basically saying, well, Bot is saying, well, you clearly are the murderer. You're just waiting here for a trap. You're going to get us all killed and things. And Doré is like, no, I've been told by Leia, I've been told by your worshipfulness that someone is coming and we need to wait for them. Yes, we may get disqualified from the race, but this is far more important than that. And the announcer starts saying, look, Solo, you've got 5 minutes, and if you don't take off in the next 5 minutes, you'll get out of the race. Then speeders head towards the Falcon. One speeder's got a couple of people in that's being shot at, and there's a few speeders following it, which are the Empire speeders. The 2 spies manage to get on board, and the Falcon takes off. Then they all start to bickering and things, and then there's a character called Uil who speaks with Han alone. And then as all the ships kind of get to the final planet, the final location of the race, the Empire is there with Star Destroyers and lots of ships and things. They're waiting for them, and the last panel of that comic is showing in the Falcon there's one of the spies is dead. So the 5th and final issue starts with the Empire firing upon, not quite hitting, but firing a lot near a lot of the ships, saying that, look, they're threatening them and saying, if you don't stop now, if you don't let us board you, if you don't surrender, we will destroy you and things. Han and Chewie shoot one of the TIE fighters immediately, which causes a huge amount of ruckus, and as that happens, Loo Re says to the rest of the pilots, quick, follow me. As that is happening and they're kind of following Loo Re, this giant space jellyfish appears, and I'm talking absolutely colossal, huge, like the size of a Star Destroyer jellyfish, just appears and starts like destroying things. And everyone is like, what the hell what's happening? And Loo Re says that essentially she opened up a temporary window in space-time, which is where some of these creatures sort of live and reside out of space-time in a place that us beings can't access, can't really understand, couldn't get to. And so she says she just opened up a temporary window to just allow this creature to come out and cause a bit of damage while they can all escape the Empire. The pilots manage to kind of outrun and escape the Empire for the time being, and And it turns out, like, it goes back to on the Falcon while Han is trying to fly and everyone's kind of squabbling and things. That bot has been brainwashed. And he dives at someone with a syringe pulled out, or he dives at Han with a syringe sort of coming out of his wrist, going for Han, saying, I'm not a killer, like running at him with his needle. Han manages to like grab and push him away, and Chewie grabs him and like slams him on the floor. And in doing so, he injects himself with this needle. Now, the needle would be lethal to anyone else, but due to his species, it just knocks him out. Uil, who is an individual who is a Feline, she speaks with Han and basically says, look, it seems that he's been brainwashed. He probably doesn't even realise he's doing it. He's clearly the person who's been killing all the other informants, and then when he sees them, his brain just goes, and he ends up killing all these people, and then coming to after the fact. Han says, look, that's fine. Well, it's annoying, but it's fine, whatever. Just keep an eye on him, keep him knocked out until we get to where we're going after all this race. Then back to the race, Loo actually says to Han over the sort of, I'm not sure if they're speaking over comms or through this weird glowing orb thing, but essentially they speak, and Loo says that her species is completely gone, and if she loses this race, that she'll die. She said there's nothing in this race. It's either I win and I live, or I lose and I die. And Han's got quite a concerned look on his face. And they get to the sort of final part of the race, and there's this sort of big Stargate sort of thing. It's just like a circle made out of metal with chunks and stuff on it, and a bit of like lightning and energy coming off it. And as they get there, basically the announcer says once they go through that gate, it's always been there for the Dragon Void races. It's a one-way. You go through the gate and then you come out where the race started, and whoever does that wins. When you do that, the gate then turns off and anyone else is left in this sort of void, this random place with very little fuel and a very great difficulty to leave and get out. Solo is at the back at this point, but he manages to overtake everyone. Then the TIE fighters seem to catch up a bit and start shooting upon people, and manages to catch a Loo Re's ship, which starts to lose power and slow down a bit. Han Solo then spins the Falcon around, kind of goes towards some of the TIE fighters, and in doing so, it means that Loo Re wins the race. So as Loo's ship wins, the gate then opens from the other side, which has never happened before, according to the announcer person. He says, like, it's only ever what's happening to the gate, it's going all crazy and things. And as the gate opens up and things, Loo's people emerge. And she thanks Solo for basically saving her. She's saying that this race was the last opportunity for her to be able to get reunited with her people who are living in the same sort of space that giant jellyfish was, outside of space-time. Her people have kind of developed so much that they're beyond the current understanding, beyond the current space-time elements that most beings live in, and that she made some mistakes before. She wasn't connected with her family as much as she should have been. She wasn't as altruistic and selfless as she should have been, so her family left without her. And then she spent all this time trying to get back with them, and because Solo let her win the race, that was enough for her to prove to them that she did want to be a part of their colony and things, and she goes with them all. And she allows the other three pilots who are remaining, Solo, the two Twi'leks, and then the Pantoran Delan Vuk, she allows them to go through the gate. They teleport and disappear to the start, and then the gate seemingly starts to destroy some of the remaining TIE fighters as it closes down. Loo Re seems to disappear forever, and that's the last of you see of her and her species, and the pilots return to the start of the race. As they get there, the announcer says, oh, how's this going to turn out? Loo won, but she seems to have disappeared. The three races that are left, are they going to split the winnings? Are they going to split the glory? Who's to say? And Han Solo is basically like, I'm not really fussed about this anymore, I've got all these people on board, and uses hyperspace and goes straight to the rebellion, leaving the other pilots there at the finish line / start line. So Han and Co managed to get to the rebellion. They managed to deliver all the people they need to Leia and things. This woman called Uil manages to give this master list to Leia, and she is actually posing as a bodyguard, but she's the one who had the sort of master list and a lot of the information from the start. She gives it to Leia, and Leia thanks her muchly, and then Leia and Han walk off and start chatting between themselves. Leia says what he did was, very reckless and put a lot of lives at risk, but he did the right thing in the end, and that's what Leia knew he would do. Leia trusted him to be able to do these things, and he passed, essentially. And then they have a little back and forth, and then she calls him like a arrogant laser brain, and he sarcastically says, your worshipfulness. And the last little panel is like a zoom in of their hands. They're looking over this, like, on some sort of balcony, and their little fingers are just touching. And it's just that little sign of their connection just after A New Hope, because obviously it starts to slowly bloom and flower as it gets to Empire Strikes Back. And that is the end of the Han Solo comic. Really enjoyed it. It's one of those really cool comics. I hadn't read it until like the last week gone by when I was reading it for this podcast, and it's a really, really cool comic. It's I didn't read out much of the dialogue and things because a lot of it is so intense and there's so much of it that if I just read out 1 or 2 panels, it wouldn't make a huge amount of sense to a lot of it. But the combination of the art style, the space battles, the dialogue, the general Chewie and Han, buddy cop sort of style is always a lot of fun. And it's a really, really cool one. If I compare it to the other 3 Heroes for a New Hope comics, I think it might be the best one, or Lando may be the best one. Obviously, this isn't officially part of the Heroes for a New Hope collection, but it was released around the same-ish time and is at the same time period and is a mini-series. So for me, out of the 4, I would probably say if you could only read one, it might be worth reading the Lando one, but the Han Solo one is a very, very close second. And then I'd probably say the Leia one and then the Chewie one, in my opinion. But they're all loads of fun. If you go back a few episodes, you'll find each of the episodes that I have done for the Heroes of New Hope collections, the Princess Leia, Chewie, and Lando ones. And that's basically it regarding those comics. Now, just to update you guys of what's happening next week, I've said it in a few other episodes as well, but it's basically a Q&A session. So I'm going to be answering some questions sent over from you guys, listeners of this podcast. I'm going to be tackling, a bit more information about Darth Maul, because not everyone has listened to the really early episodes about him, just how he ends up being in Solo, if he was killed in Phantom Menace, because if you haven't watched the series, Clone Wars or Rebels, you won't really know anything else about him. And I'm going to talk about how Dooku became evil. I'm going to talk about some of my favourite characters and favourite comics and things, and just a few other bits and pieces. So if you want to get any questions into me, make sure you send them across. Either you can email me at starwarscomicsincanon@outlook.com, or you can contact me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. All of those places are where I post information both about Star Wars Comics in Canon. I post photos of the comics themselves, normally the cover, the title crawl, maybe a few of the covers within as well, because I've either got the actual individual comics with normal covers without variants, or I've got the sort of collection, which the trade paperback, which I get quite a lot of now because it's cheaper and just easier to get a trade paperback, and within them they have a lot of variants and things, so I normally try and take quite a few photos of those things. They all go on Instagram and Facebook. Twitter's normally 1 or 2 photos, but if you follow on social media and you want to know what these comics sort of look like, make sure you go check that out. Keep up to date with me at following Genuine Chit-Chat, because I post about Star Wars Comics in Canon as well as my other show, which is called Genuine Chit-Chat, where I have a different guest on each episode and talk about a huge variety of things depending on the guest. So yeah, that's going to be about it from me, guys. I really appreciate you guys listening. Make sure you check out all the other shows on the feed of Comics in Motion. There's loads of great ones, and I've been involved with a couple of them here and there as well. And that's loads of fun. Obviously, if you're listening to this already, you're on the right feed, so just listen to lots of the other ones. That's all a barrel of fun. But I think that's basically it for me, guys. Make sure you send those questions in if you want them answered. You'll need to send them after this episode drops. I'd say, the cut-off point's probably going to be like Wednesday or Thursday-ish time. So we're currently on the 5th of the 9th at the moment. So I'd say if you get all the questions in by Wednesday the 9th, so 9th of the 9th, if you get that over to me then I'll be sure to include it. And if you want me to do any shout-outs for anything, just say, please shout out, and then put your Twitter handle or whatever you want me to shout out, and I'll do that when I do the question. Because I've got quite a few questions, but a lot of you haven't necessarily wanted me to read out your names, so which is perfectly fine. Anyway, guys, thanks again for listening. I'll talk to all of you next week for the Q&A, and may the Force be with you.